Now, a lot of times Christians can be asked the question, how do you know God exists? Which is a good question. I mean, we can't see God, we can't hear his voice, and I couldn't introduce you to him. So how can you believe in something that you can't see? A lot of people can say, you can't prove God exists, which is true in a sense, but just because Christians can't give you direct evidence for God's existence, we still have strong reasons to believe that there is a God. So in our next series, we will be responding to the following statement, you can't prove God exists. One reason why people don't believe in God is because they believe in science. We live in an age of science and all those religious fanatics need to get with the times. Many times people can make the assumption that people who believe in God only believe in God out of blind faith. Just believe, ignore the science and commit intellectual suicide and believe in God already. But it's important to note that science and God aren't opposed to each other. There are some renowned scientists who believed in God, such as Sir Isaac Newton, Johannes Kepler, and Francis Bacon. In fact, many of these believing scientists used God as their motivation for their scientific contributions. It's also important to note that science can't solve all of life's questions. People can make claims like, you can't prove Christianity scientifically, so it can't be true. But science isn't the only way to prove something's authenticity. Let's take a look at scientific proofs. When you prove something scientifically, you use the scientific method. You make observations, form a hypothesis, and in a controlled environment, you conduct tests and analyze the results to see if your hypothesis was true or not. And then from there, you can either draw a conclusion or conduct more tests. You see, a large part of proving something scientifically is conducting tests over and over again and observing their results. And this method is incredibly useful, but it can't answer all of life's questions. And here's some questions science can't answer. Was George Washington the first president of the United States? Was Martin Luther King Jr. a civil rights activist? Did Alexander the Great rule in Greece? And was Plato the student of Socrates? You see, when you start asking questions dealing with history, you have to look at the historical proofs where you determine whether the evidence provided is trustworthy. You have to weigh everything that's there. You have to look at the written testimonies, any eyewitness accounts, artifacts, oral testimonies, etc. You can't use the scientific method in determining if Aristotle, Alexander the Great, or if Caesar Augustus existed. You would have to look at all the manuscripts and evidence for their existence. So if you look at Jesus and the Christian movement that followed his resurrection, you have to realize that those events can't be proven scientifically, but they can be proven through records of written testimonies. If you look at Jesus and the Christian movement that followed his resurrection, you have to realize that those events can't be proven scientifically, but they can be proven through records of written testimonies. You see, if you look at the person of Jesus of Nazareth, you'd find that he's a unique figure in history with a substantial amount of evidence for his existence. There's thousands of manuscripts written about him. And if you can prove the existence of Jesus, then you have to look at who he claimed to be. And he claimed to be God as seen in John 5:18 and John chapter 10, verses 30 to 33. So what reasons do you have to believe in God's existence? Well, Jesus' existence points to God's existence because of his claim to be God. And the argument is broken down like this. The first premise is that Jesus existed. The second premise is that Jesus claimed to be God. The third premise is that Jesus proved he was God, whether it was through his miracles, resurrection, or fulfillment of prophecies. And if these three premises are correct, then the conclusion naturally follows, which is that God exists. If someone disagrees with the conclusion, then they have to disprove one of the premises just discussed. They could argue against the first premise and claim that Jesus never existed, but there's plenty of manuscript evidence for that. And if they reject those manuscripts, then how can we believe in Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, or Alexander the Great since they were based on fewer manuscripts? If we can't believe in Jesus, then why should we believe anything else in ancient history? If they disagree with the second premise and argue against Jesus' claims to be God, then all you have to do is point to scripture where Jesus claims that he was God, or point to passages that depict Jesus as God. People can make the argument that you can't use the Bible to prove the Bible, but right now all you're doing is establishing the fact that Jesus claimed to be God. And on a side note, the New Testament is supported by over 24,000 manuscripts, so it's not an empty argument when you use the Bible. If they disagree with the third premise, that Jesus proved to be God, you can give them evidence for the resurrection or the fulfillment of prophecy, which are strong reasons to at least consider Jesus' deity, since rising from the dead and the fulfillment of multiple prophecies made hundreds of years prior are both impossible. And if these three premises are correct, that Jesus existed, that Jesus claimed to be God, and that Jesus proved to be God, then the conclusion must be true, and that's that God exists. So to wrap everything up, did I prove that God does in fact exist? No, but I gave a reason why you could believe in God, and there are others that we will share as we continue in our series. So when you pray, remember that God hears your prayers. And when you read the Bible, know there's a God you're learning about. And when the time comes when you doubt God's existence, because the time will come, remember that our faith is not blind and that we do have reasons for our beliefs. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. So today we live in a unique age of science and information, and there are some who claim that Christians really need to get with the times, because the problem with Jesus Christ's deity and resurrection is that you can't prove them scientifically. And it's true, you can't prove those things scientifically. So Christians must have blind faith. People believed in God back then because they needed help with all their problems and they couldn't explain certain phenomena such as rain or earthquakes. But now that mankind is more advanced, the need for some kind of higher power is gone. Christians just can't accept the fact that old tradition and religions are dying and that we all must adapt to the age of science and technology. So the question we're going to answer today is, do Christians have blind faith? Now to begin, we have to start out by saying that Christianity cannot be proven scientifically. And there are some who believe that science and religion are totally opposed to each other because science is based on evidence and reason, and religion is based on belief and faith. So are they really opposites? Are people really forced to choose one or the other? First off, let's look at science and the scientific method. Now, the scientific method is a process where people use techniques to gather data and information to draw conclusions. And you have a few basic steps that are generally followed. First off, people observe the world around them, which then leads to them having a question about something in particular, and from there they do research, construct a hypothesis or an educated guess, and they conduct experiments or tests to see if their hypothesis is correct. After the experiments are done, they analyze the information, and they can either draw a conclusion or do more research and make more hypotheses and conduct more tests. When it comes to proving something scientifically, people must be able to repeat the tests in a controlled environment. For example, if the farmer Tommy here is making a hypothesis that corn grows faster than tomatoes, if his environment isn't controlled, then his conclusions may be inaccurate. Both plants must be planted in the same area, be given the same amount of water, and given the same amount of care, because if these things weren't the same, then if the corn did grow faster than the tomatoes, then it may only be because that the corn had better growing conditions or because they got more water, etc. The whole point is that in order to prove something scientifically, people need to be able to repeat tests in a controlled environment. And if that's the case, no one will ever be able to prove Jesus' deity or his resurrection simply because you cannot repeat events of the past. What people need to know here is that the scientific method isn't the only way to prove facts. Let's think about this. Can you scientifically prove that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in 1865? Or that George Washington was the first president of the United States? Or that Alexander the Great was mentored by Aristotle? Or that Socrates or Plato even existed? No, you can't scientifically prove any of those things because now we're not in the realm of science, we're in the realm of history. People still believe in the existence of Martin Luther King Jr. and Lincoln and Washington, Alexander the Great, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, right? Why? Because they are historically supported. People wrote about them. People recorded their accomplishments, their ideas, and their contributions to mankind. And we have historians who evaluate how trustworthy these recordings are. So when people try to prove something historically, they evaluate oral testimonies and written testimonies, among other things. So can Jesus Christ's existence, deity, and resurrection be proven scientifically? Absolutely not. Why? Because you can't repeat history, and it would be foolish to try to. But you can support Jesus' existence historically. A lot of people say that Jesus is just a myth, a fable, a fairy tale, but you can look and see that Jesus' life is supported by thousands of manuscripts, and his biographies were claimed to have been based on eyewitnesses that interacted with Jesus himself. In fact, the New Testament of the Bible has about 24,000 manuscripts supporting it. So it's not like the claims of the Bible are empty claims. It's recorded that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, which is located in Israel, which are real places that you could visit today. On top of that, Jesus' life is mentioned by people who lived during Jesus' time who weren't even Christians, like Tacitus, Josephus, and Pliny the Younger. And if people try to deny all of these pieces of evidence of Jesus' life, then they would also need to reject the evidence that we have for other figures in ancient history. So when we ask the question, do Christians have blind faith? The simple answer to that would have to be no, because their claims to Jesus' existence is based on history, manuscript evidence, and eyewitness testimony. So we have Jesus' existence supported, but do we have reason to believe in Jesus' deity and resurrection? Go ahead and check out our videos defending Jesus' deity and resurrection. And if you have any questions, thoughts, suggestions, or if you just want to say hi, leave a comment below. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends, and we hope that you have a good one. God bless. So Christianity is a pretty big religion, and a lot of people tend to believe in God and the Bible. But have you ever thought of disproving Christianity? There's people who believe the Bible is false and they give their reasons why. But if you wanted to take a shortcut in destroying the Christian faith, the first thing you'd have to do is prove that Jesus Christ's resurrection was false. The resurrection of Jesus was the central truth of Christianity, and even Paul, a New Testament writer for many books of the Bible, says in 1 Corinthians 15:17, "And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins." The word futile here means worthless and unprofitable, meaning if anyone disproved the resurrection, it would result in disproving the faith of all Christians. Their faith would be worthless. But is it possible to disprove the resurrection? Christians actually claim that Jesus died and that he rose again from the dead. Let's check out some alternative theories to see if they can stand the test and prove Christianity to be false and worthless. So maybe someone stole the body then. That would make sense. Jesus didn't really come back from the dead. Someone took the body. So did the Romans steal the body? First off, the Romans would have no reason to steal Christ's body. Their main motive was to keep the Jews at bay and in control. They sought to keep peace in Palestine. Jesus' missing body caused all sorts of commotions that could have easily been avoided if the Romans just uncovered the body they stole. So how about the Jewish religious leaders? They could have stole it. Well, these leaders would have no motive in stealing the body, since that would only stir up the Christian movement. They killed Jesus to shut him up, so why would they steal his body? Jesus' disciples were preaching saying Jesus is risen. If the religious leaders had the body, they could have said, "We have his body, he didn't really rise again," and be quiet. If that happened, Christianity would have stopped then and there. But you also have Jesus' disciples and followers. It was them, they stole the body. But this doesn't make sense either. History tells us that all of Jesus' disciples except Judas Iscariot and John died for their faith. It was believed John died of old age, and Judas, well, he was hanging around. So if Jesus' body really was stolen by his disciples, then why would these other 10 men die horrible deaths for their faith? Some were crucified, stabbed, hung, beheaded. One had his head clubbed. Some were stoned. I know they weren't high. Others were whipped, and someone was even dragged around the city until his body was in pieces. So, if these disciples all died for this resurrected Jesus, why would they all be willing to die for a lie? It would make more sense for them to save themselves. On top of that, after Jesus died, all the cowardly disciples were hiding because they were all freaked out about dying too. They were in no condition to fight the Roman soldiers that were, by the way, guarding the body of Jesus. So since Jesus' body couldn't have been stolen, there has to be another explanation. Let's look at the wrong tomb theory. This theory says that the woman who reported the body missing mistakenly went to the wrong tomb that morning. They freaked out and were all like, Jesus rose again, thus Christianity was born. But this wouldn't make much sense because the Roman guards protecting Jesus' body would have produced the body of Jesus before Christianity became a big deal. How about the hallucination theory? Those crazy Christians were all hallucinating. Those religious nuts, This theory claims that the appearances of Jesus after the resurrection were either illusions or hallucinations. But this theory is contrary to psychological principles governing the occurrence of hallucinations. According to 1 Corinthians 15:6, Jesus appeared to over 500 people at one time. It's not credible to think that 500 people all saw the same hallucination and then some were willing to die for it. And if they were hallucinating, then Jesus' body would have still been there, and then those possessing it would have produced it. Well, maybe it's the swoon theory. The swoon theory states that Jesus never died. He merely fainted from exhaustion and loss of blood. Everyone thought he was dead, but later he resuscitated, and the disciples thought it to be a resurrection. But in Mark 15:44, it states that a centurion checked to see if Jesus was dead. A centurion was a Roman soldier who was in charge of 100 other soldiers. He was a leader in the great and all-powerful Roman Empire who was trained to kill and subdue all who opposed Rome. Crucifixion was capital punishment, and if the soldier was wrong in determining if Jesus was dead, the soldier would have severe consequences. Mistakes weren't allowed. Jesus did die, and he was even stabbed with a spear up his side to guarantee his death. There's also the moved body theory, which says that the body was moved by the authorities to a different tomb. But that doesn't make any sense either. If the authorities had the body in their possession or knew where it was, why didn't they explain that they took it? This was a weak theory. Next, the relocated body theory. This one says that the tomb of Jesus was empty, not because he resurrected, but because the body was simply relocated. Thus, the disciples mistakenly believed that he was resurrected. This relocation hypothesis gains support from the fact that reburial was common in ancient Palestine. However, Jewish tradition differs. Jewish tradition was to bury a body for 1 year, and then after the flesh deteriorated and only the bones remained, they would then remove the bones and place them in an ossuary. But the main problem for the relocation of the body of Jesus is the complete lack of historical support, either in biblical or non-biblical sources. And it's important to note that the empty tomb didn't convince any of the disciples that Jesus rose again, except maybe John. It was the appearance of Jesus that transformed the weenie disciples into brave evangelists willing to die for their faith. And the last popular alternative to the resurrection is the copycat theory, which says nothing in Christianity is original. Jesus was just another dying and rising god in the tradition of Osiris, Mithras, Adonis, and Dionysus. There's plenty of other gods, religious figures, and mythology guys that died and rose again. But the only problem with this view is that Jesus of Nazareth actually ate, slept, performed miracles, died, and returned to life. All of these accounts are supported by a reliable historical record. In contrast, the dying and rising gods of the mystery religions were timeless myths, repeated annually with the changing seasons. So, after looking at all these other theories, it looks like Christians have some solid evidence that Jesus not only existed, but died and rose again. And if he did rise again from the dead, then it forces us to really consider Christianity. Rising from the dead after 3 days is impossible. He was beat up to the point where he was unrecognizable, whipped with his back torn open to where you can see his spine and bowels, and then he was nailed to a cross. You see, if you want to disprove Christianity, you have to answer to Jesus' resurrection. This isn't something you can dismiss and sweep under the rug, because if Jesus did rise from the dead, then he is who he claimed to be, and he claimed to be God. He claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one can come to the Father except by him. Jesus claimed to be God and then proved it through his resurrection. We all sinned, messed up, and our penalty was death and separation from God. But Jesus died on the cross for our sin to take our punishment, and he rose again so he can be the bridge between man and God. You see, if you're not a Christian, you have to make a choice. Either try to disprove Christianity by thinking of some other possibility, or know that Jesus really did die and rise from the dead. Romans 10:9. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved.
If any.
Well, let's move on to the final question. And actually, there's two that more or less ask the same question, and I think probably it's best for you to begin on this one, John. Someone asks, why does John specifically believe in the Christian God? What about other religions? And another person asks a similar question, how is one to decide between the thousands of faith on offer without the use of a reliable method such as science. So why your God and not another one, John, and how do you come to that conclusion in the first place?
This is quite a sensitive question, but the only way I can approach it is by Peter's method of rational inquiry. And you see, at one level, let's take the three monotheistic religions. But before I say anything, this is important. You've heard me clearly say that I believe you, whatever you believe, are made in the image of God and therefore of infinite value. Secondly, you've heard me say that I believe that there's a common element in morality. So when you raise with me the questions of other religions, please understand, I'm not criticizing your morality. That is very important. Nor am I criticizing your value. I'm being asked a rational question. On what basis do you choose? So I'll tell you. Here is one level. The three great monotheistic religions, their attitude to the resurrection, forgive me, Peter, if I raise it again, is, forgive the pun, it wasn't intended, my Jewish friends believe that Jesus died and did not rise. My Muslim friends believe he didn't die. I believe he both died and rose. Those three things cannot be simultaneously historically correct. So we have to do investigations in exactly the same way as we investigate any event in history. We can't repeat it to see what happened, but we can make an inference to the best explanation. And all I can say in the short answer is, I've done that investigation many times and come to the conclusion that the Christian explanation is true. But there's a second explanation, and it's this. I often ask myself, traveling around the world as I've done, ask people of different religions what they mean by a religion. And they usually come up with something like Southampton University. In the following sense, you have an entrance exam into the university and you get in. And then you're on the way or the path and you're being taught by delightful professors. And then you face the final judgment, which is called finals. Do you recognize that? Okay. Now, on the way, on your path, the professors, however kind they are, cannot guarantee that you're going to get through at the end. Why? Because the basic principle of a university course is merit. Now, many of my friends, when I ask them about religion, including Christianity, they say, that's it. There's a ceremony at the beginning, perhaps performed at a child or an adult. Then you're on the way, or the Eightfold Path, or whatever it is, the Tao, the teaching. And then you're faced with a final assessment. But the teachers, the gurus, and all the rest of them, the priests, cannot guarantee your acceptance of that final judgment.
I think I can provide...
I
thought you finished.
No, I think John hasn't quite hit the punchline yet.
I haven't hit the punchline. Christianity, if that's what religion is, Christianity is not a religion for a very simple reason. In Christianity, the acceptance comes at the beginning, not the end. Now, I mentioned that briefly on the way through tonight, and this is the spectacular difference that as I sit here, I've not reached the final judgment, but I know that I'm accepted. Why? Because I'm very good? No. Because of what Christ has done. And the absolute essence of what it is to be a Christian is that I have trusted him, that what he did on the cross, now this may seem all mystique to you, but let me say what it is, that what he did there means that I can be accepted at the beginning of the journey. That makes a spectacular difference. In fact, you wouldn't if it was a question of marriage. Imagine I propose to a girl and say, look, here's a cookbook. There are rules in it. You keep them pretty well for the next 40 years and then I'll accept you. Well, she'd throw the book in my face. But that's what many of us think of God. No wonder people give up on religion, in my view.
Have you finished?
Because it becomes a slavish trying to merit acceptance when Christ is prepared to give his salvation as a free gift. So I'm not doing this evening, for example, to gain brownie points with God. I'm doing it because God has accepted me, and that is the wonder of Christianity to me.
Most of the difficulty of understanding the universe lies in the vast complexity of life. That's what really, truly impresses people. That's why people who believe in God mostly do believe in God, because they look around the living world and they see how impressive it is. So that level of impressiveness is completely destroyed by Darwin, and Darwin, of course, doesn't explain the origin of the universe. For that, I invoke the anthropic principle and the multiverse. Less satisfying, admittedly, but science makes progress. The one thing you can be absolutely sure is that a creative designer cannot be a satisfying explanation.
Dr. Lennox.
The anthropic principle, as you stated, Richard, I think is a complete truism. Of course we have to be in such and such a kind of planet of the kind that we could appear on. That does not answer the question how we came to exist on it. And I fear I have to disagree with you on Darwinism. Darwinism does not explain life. It may explain certain things about what happens when you've got life. But evolution assumes the existence of a mutating replicator. It does not explain how that replicator came to exist in the first place. Now, that's a major discussion. I want to address the who designed the designer question, because it's the old schoolboy question, who created God? I'm actually very surprised to find it as a central argument in your book, because it assumes that God is created. And I'm not surprised, therefore, that you call the book The God Delusion, because created gods are by definition a delusion. Now, I know, and I ought to explain, that Richard doesn't like people who say to him that they don't believe in the God he doesn't believe in. But I think that this is possibly touching a sore spot, because you leave yourself wide open to the charge. After all, you are arguing that God is a delusion. And in order to weigh your argument, I said that it is you who's arguing that God is a delusion.
Oh, sorry. All right, thank you.
And in order to weigh that argument, I need to know what you mean by God. And if you say, if there is a God, you have to ask who created God, that means that you're reduced to thinking about created gods. Well, none of us believe in created gods, Jews, Muslims, or Christians. And I think that argument then is entirely beside the point, and perhaps you ought to put it on your shelf marked celestial teapots where it belongs. Distressed by that. But finally, a word about miracles. This is a massive subject. You claim with David Hume that miracles violate the laws of nature. Well, David Hume's a very curious person to quote on this topic, because David Hume didn't believe really in the laws of cause and effect on which laws of nature are founded. He didn't believe in causality, and he didn't appear to believe in the principle of induction. And so that he's not a very good authority to quote. Secondly, I do not think that miracles are violations of the laws of nature, because the laws of nature describe what normally happens. God, who is the God of this universe and created it with its regularities, is perfectly at liberty to feed a new event into the universe. Just as C.S. Lewis makes a point, if I put $2 plus $2 in my desk tonight, $4. If I find in the morning there is $1, I don't say that the laws of arithmetic have been broken. I say the laws of Alabama have been broken. I think the book The God Delusion gives the game away in the dedication at the front of the book to Douglas Adams, where he says, isn't it enough to see that a garden is beautiful without having to believe that there are fairies at the bottom of it too? Now, you do a brilliant job at getting rid of the fairies, though it must be said that most of them didn't believe in them anyway. But when you see the beauty of a garden, say in New College in Oxford, do you believe there's no gardener or no owner? That its sublime beauty has come about from raw nature by pure chance? Of course not. For gardens are to be distinguished from raw nature by the operation of intelligence. And what you're doing in your book, I think, is presenting us with an obviously false set of alternatives. Either we take gardens on their own or the garden plus fairies. But they don't appear on their own. They have gardeners and owners. So does the universe. You say there's no evidence of God, and yet your very description of the universe as a garden bears witness that the evidence is all around you. Blind faith can be very dangerous, especially if it's coupled with a blind obedience to an evil authority. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to emphasize, is true whether the blind faith is that of religious or secular people. But not all faith is blind faith, because faith itself carries with it the ideas of belief, trust, commitment, and is therefore only as robust as the evidence for it. I can't speak authoritatively for other religions, but faith in the Christian sense is not blind. And indeed, I do not know a serious Christian who thinks it is. Indeed, as I read it, blind faith in idols and figments of the human imagination, in other words, delusional gods, is roundly condemned in the Bible. My faith in God and Christ as the Son of God is no delusion. It is rational and evidence-based. Part of the evidence is objective. Some of it comes from science, some comes from history, and some is subjective, coming from experience.
At this 2016 conference, the opening talk was given by a prominent Austrian evolutionary biologist, not an American talk show host. And he enumerated 5 major explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism.
You know, my big question for all atheists, is okay, you don't believe in God, but what was there before the Big Bang, before this all started? In other words, what was there before supposedly nothing?
Dr. Stephen Meyer recently went on Piers Morgan's Uncensored show, and they talk about evolution, and then they talk about the origin of the universe. They also get into a conversation about abiogenesis. Dr. Meyer articulates himself so well and raises a few huge issues that are used often as a cudgel to prevent people from actually seeing the logical case for the existence of God. Let's dive in.
This all blew up last week because Tucker Carlson went on Joe Rogan. And I don't know if you saw this, but he said this about this very issue. Let's take a look.
If evolution is real, and if there is this constant, I don't know, but it's visible. Like, you can measure it in certain animals.
You can measure adaptation.
Yeah.
But there's no evidence that in fact, I think we've kind of given up on the idea of evolution. The theory of evolution as articulated by Darwin is like kind of not true. Right?
In what sense?
Well, in the most basic sense, the idea that, all life emerged from a single cell organism and over time, and there would be a fossil record of that, and there's not.
Your response?
Well, I don't know what Tucker knows about all this, but
probably not as qualified as you. But he likes to.
Maybe we start with
ask
something
around.
that happened here in London a few years ago, 2016. A major conference convened by the Royal Society, arguably the world's most august and prestigious scientific body, was convened by a group of evolutionary biologists who are dissatisfied with the standard neo-Darwinian theory of evolution. And many of the conveners are calling for a new theory because the primary mechanism of biological change articulated by Darwin and his subsequent followers, now called the neo-Darwinists, the idea of natural selection acting on random mutations and variations, is now understood to lack the creative power to generate major changes in the history of life.
And at the crux of this debate, is it, as Tucker was getting at there, is it that if you actually start from where Darwin's theory begins, the creation of the human being was so complicated, the body, the way we exist is so complicated, it doesn't make any rational sense.
There's 2 issues, really. There's how do you get to the first life from the simpler non-living chemicals? That's sometimes called chemical evolutionary theory, and that's a complete mess. It's in a state of impasse, and almost everyone, even your recent guest Richard Dawkins, acknowledges we have no chemical evolutionary theory that accounts for the origin of the first life. And many people don't know that Darwin didn't attempt to explain the origin of the first life. Rather, he presumed one or very few simple organisms, which we now know were not simple, and then proposed a mechanism by which you could generate all the new forms of life we see on the planet today.
So this is the point that Dr. Meyer is making, is that the thing that kids are taught in school of primordial soup leading to modern man is mythology. It's literally mythology. It has not been supported with scientific evidence. Darwin never touched on the origin of life. No scientist has explained how life came about from non-life. It's a huge black hole in the scientific community. And in fact, as Dr. James Tour has pointed out, the goalposts are moving farther away as scientists study this more. So, okay, now Dr. Meyer is going to get into, in addition to the origin of life problem, some of the problems with so-called macroevolution.
But even that now is being challenged because the main mechanism of evolutionary change does a nice job of explaining small-scale variation. What Tucker was referring to, I think, is adaptation. This would be examples like Darwin's finches, where the beaks get a little bigger, a little smaller in response to varying weather patterns. But it does a very poor job of explaining the major innovations in the history of life, such as the origin of birds or mammals or animals in the first place. And there in the fossil record, we do see very abrupt, many instances of very abrupt appearance without the transitional intermediates that you'd expect on the basis of the Darwinian picture of the tree of life.
So, is your belief that the Darwin theory actually fails then?
I think it does fail. I think it captures an element of the truth. There's the small-scale microevolutionary variation is certainly a real process, and no one disputes that. Natural selection is a real process, but what's at issue now is the degree to which it has genuine creative power. And I think at this 2016 conference, the opening talk was given by a prominent Austrian evolutionary biologist, not an American talk show host. And he enumerated 5 major explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism, many of them surrounding this problem that the mechanism lacks the generative or creative power necessary to account for the major innovations in the history of life.
Well, your best-selling book, new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, you argue there are 3 big scientific discoveries that point to the existence of God. I want to go through these. One, the Big Bang Theory. So why would that lend support to a theory of a God? Or
well,
God?
Right. Maybe just a little framing before I dive into the evidence. Professor Dawkins at Oxford has said that the universe has precisely the properties that we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And though I'm on the opposite side of this science v. God issue with the good professor, I think he does a marvelous job of framing key issues. And this is one of those great framing quotations. Because what he's saying is that whether we think of it as a scientific question or a philosophical question or both, if we have a hypothesis about reality, the way we test that is by looking at the world around us and seeing if what we see comports with what we would expect to see if our hypothesis were true. And his hypothesis is that of blind, pitiless indifference, which is a shorthand way of saying that everything came about by strictly undirected material processes. And what the materialists expected coming into the early 20th century was evidence of an eternal, self-existent universe, one that had been here for an infinitely long time and therefore did not need an external creator. What in fact the astrophysicists, the cosmologists, the astronomers found was evidence of a universe that had a definite beginning, and therefore one that could not have created itself, because before the matter of the universe came into existence, there was no matter there to do the causing. And so the picture of the universe that has emerged starting from the 1920s all the way to the present, both from observational astronomy and from theoretical physics, is a universe that had a definite beginning and therefore requires some sort of external creator or cause.
Again, let me just very briefly highlight this point because it is so crucial. The more that science has understood the origin of the universe, the more clear it has become that the universe is not eternal into the past, but in fact had a definite beginning at a particular point in time. This idea of the singularity, that the universe itself had a beginning, that space-time is a continuum. Space, time, and matter all began, and that raises a very significant philosophical question, because in order for it to be a scientific question, it has to be observable. How do you observe the beginning of the universe? No one will ever be able to. This is not repeatable. This is not observable. This is all looking back into the past history of the universe to make what then becomes a philosophical assessment about, well, if the universe began, then what began it, or how did it begin?
Dawkins is obviously one of the world's most famous atheists. Are you a believer in God yourself?
I do believe in God, yes.
Okay, so let's play a clip from Dawkins on this show. So
Yes.
why is it not possible that there is a superior being, power, which many people believe in different
It's
ways?
possible there are
different
fairies
types
at the
of
bottom
God?
of the garden. I mean, all sorts of things are possible. You can't deny that.
Well, except I've never seen fairies at the end of the garden, have you?
No, you've never seen God either.
No, but you don't know for sure that either doesn't exist.
No, I don't know that fairies don't exist. Fairies may be leprechauns, for all I know.
You know, my big question for all atheists, well, is okay, you don't believe in God, but what was there before the Big Bang, before this all started? In other words, what was there before supposedly nothing? What is nothing? Nothing to me seems to be a totally incongruous word. What is nothingness? And if you can't explain it, to me, and I believe in God, but to me, it suggests there must be a power bigger than the human mind at the start of all this that was able to comprehend what may have happened, because we can't.
Right. Dawkins wants to portray theistic belief as if it's equivalent to belief in fairies, and he'll concede that, well, it's possible. But I think there's a stronger argument for the theistic case. And that is that when scientists and philosophers reason from evidence, they typically use a method of reasoning that has a technical name. It's called inferring to the best explanation, where the best explanation is one where you're invoking a cause which has the kind of powers that would be required to explain the phenomenon of interest. And you correctly pointed out in your conversation with him that when you get back to that, what physicists often call the singularity, the point where matter, space, time, and energy begin to exist, the materialist is really up against a huge conundrum, because prior to the origin of matter, there is no matter to do the causing. That's what we mean by the origin of matter, that's where it starts.
Right.
And so if you want to invoke a cause which is sufficient to explain the origin of matter, you can't invoke matter. It's in principle, the materialistic explanations are in principle insufficient. So you need to invoke something which is external to the material universe and is not bounded by time and space as well. And that starts to paint a picture of the kind of cause you would need that has the sort of attributes that traditional theists have traditionally associated with God. God is a timeless, God is outside of time and space, has causal powers, is an agent with volition, and therefore can initiate a change of state from, in this case, nothing to something.
And do you believe that God...
I could already anticipate in the comment section of this video that there's going to be atheists racing to the keyboard to type that there isn't any evidence for this God, so therefore God is just like believing in the flying spaghetti monster, a unicorn, a fairy, whatever. But may I just suggest that when you're asking for material evidence of an immaterial God, it's like asking for evidence of a three-dimensional object within a two-dimensional plane. And I've tried to lay that out in the short form video. I'm going to unpack that a little bit more in this video, where if you begin a priori with the assumption that the only type of reality that exists is material reality, then obviously if you're asking for material evidence of an immaterial God, you can say that there is no such evidence. But the problem is that the universe, the matter, the material itself did come into existence at a point in the past, which raises the question, where did matter itself come from? And it opens up a window to another mode of reality, an immaterial mode of reality, what some have called the mind of God, which is the impetus for both the universal constants, things like gravity and the speed of light, that are these fixed principles that the rest of the matter and space and time within the universe operate by. But when you look at fixed mathematical truths, those things also point back to a mind. And like Dr. Meyer said, mind is capable of creation. Raw mathematical truths themselves don't actually have a creative apparatus. Matter itself does not have a creative apparatus. Mind does have a creative apparatus.